Welcome to Lights Camera Author, the podcast where we explore the stories behind the stories with today's most fascinating writers. And I'm Jim Juno. For more than 60 years, the Beatles have remained the most influential band in popular music history. There have been countless books written about John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Every recording session, every concert, every triumph, and every breakup has been thoroughly examined. But today, I'm talking with an author who's written a book about the man who's made it all possible. Brian Epstein wasn't a musician. He didn't write songs or perform on stage. But without his vision, determination, and unwavering belief in four young musicians from Liverpool, Beatlemania may never have happened. My guest is one of the world's foremost Beatles historians, Philip Norman, and he has spent decades chronicling the lives of the Fab Four. Now he's turned his attention to the remarkable man often called the Fifth Beatle. Philip Norman, your new book is Mr. Moonlight, Brian Epstein, and the Making of the Beatles, and welcome to Light Camera Author.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to be here.
Now, you spent your career writing about the Beatles themselves, but what convinced you that Brian Epstein's story still needed to be told?
Well, of course, I'd written a biography of the Beatles and then individual biographies of John and Paul and George. And that introduced me to the subject. But it actually showed me, really, over time, what an extraordinary achievement was Brian Epstein's. Absolutely jaw dropping, amazing achievement. But also the terrible problems that he had to face, even at the very height of his success. The problem of anti Semitism, which we think now is sort of rather sickeningly peculiar to this age, but in fact was very, very bad at that time, and also homophobia. He had to deal with both of those shadows on the sort of fantastic golden success that he created.
That's exactly true. I mean, he was during the time of his life in the 60s, homosexuality was a crime in the UK, wasn't it?
I believe, yes, punishable by imprisonment with a maximum of life imprisonment.
My goodness. I mean, and when was that? That was changed, what, back in was it right after he died, like in
No,
67?
it was just slightly before that. It was decriminalized up to a point. It didn't help Brian because his tastes still lay outside the law. Wouldn't be today, but at that time it was considered a great stroke of liberalism that it ceased to be a criminal offence, at least for
Yes.
certain people, but not everybody.
Well, I mean, many people know Brian Epstein as the fifth Beatle, but when I was reading your book, that title may actually undersell his importance, and I'd like to
I
know
think,
why.
well, I think so. It was quite extraordinary. Firstly, you have to say that he was like no other manager had ever been. They were not generally a very, salubrious group of people, top managers, and very little, very not generally known to the public at large. And they were known, if at all, for defrauding and exploiting their young, usually naive young male charges, mostly males. Brian was of a different stamp. He was very, very honest. He was open. He was very, very polite, charming, and honourable. All of these things that these people had never been before, which, of course, was an extraordinary thing for somebody like that to be. He wasn't out to exploit them. Um, in fact, he didn't need to. He was well up, well set up in a business, his family business already in Liverpool. The thing was that Brian couldn't have married, couldn't have adopted children. The Beatles became like his children. He protected them and shielded them as if they were his own boys. He called them the boys, even though he was only a very few years older than the oldest of them. And that's how he devoted himself to protecting them and to shielding them from this terrible fame that they eventually had, the fame that could have torn them to pieces, literally as well as psychologically. Brian was their defense. He was their shield. They only realized that, of course, after his very sad premature death at the age of 32.
Exactly. I mean, that's the amazing thing. And what did he see? What was he able to see in the Beatles that so many, I mean, so many record executives turned them down. What did they
Yes,
miss?
well, they hadn't really had a proper sort of go at. They'd had various people calling themselves managers, never very, sometimes two at once, in fact, but never doing anything really seriously for them. They'd only been playing in Hamburg, in what was then West Germany. Brian had this vision, which he articulated as making them bigger than Elvis. Elvis Presley was the biggest thing popular music had ever seen at the time. He was very much mocked for saying that. He was actually made them bigger than 20 Elvises. He made them bigger than any earthly instrument could measure, which was quite extraordinary. I mean, there was simply no limit to the fame that they had and to the influence they had on other musicians, of course, and eventually socially, because what Brian did was made pop music through them acceptable, not just to the blue collar constituency who had liked rock and roll a few years earlier when young people used to break up cinemas, Bill Haley and the Comets and all that.
Oh, yeah.
Brian didn't adulterate their personalities or their music, but he cleaned them up. As one of the Cavern Club regulars said, after Brian got hold of them, they looked as if they'd been steam cleaned. And so
Yes.
they were not threatening in any way. They were charming. He found the charm and the comedy which always existed in Liverpool musicians. Nobody had really seen it before. There were other pop musicians came from Liverpool. No one had seen the way to make them have that appeal, that charm, which charm is said to be a British weakness, but in this case it was a massive strength.
Yeah, and a lot of people nowadays they don't remember that before Brian Epstein, the Beatles. A lot of people nowadays remember the Beatles in the suits and ties from the Ed Sullivan Show, but before Brian Epstein, they wore leather jackets and greased back hair.
And they were proto-punks. I mean, the
Mhm.
behavior went with it, especially John Lennon in Hamburg did things that I still can't write. I mean, they were proto-punks. But Brian, they were said to have resented the fact that Brian put them into suits. But being absolutely classy to a degree, the suits that Brian put them into were bespoke suits of what was called brushed tweed. John didn't mind having that kind of a suit at all. Of course, neither did the others.
See, that's amazing. Yeah, and that opened doors for them, didn't it?
I'm sorry.
That opened doors
Well, yeah,
for
yes. I
them.
mean, it caused this is a story about the English class system, and it made it possible for middle class teenagers to like the Beatles. And eventually, their parents, their grandparents, even the royal family they could all be Beatlemaniacs. The first album the Beatles made, they were sort of shown on the cover as these rather hard boiled scousers. The camera didn't love them particularly. 8 months later, they were their faces were in shadow. They were wearing polo necks. They looked like art students or habitués of the Parisian left bank. And of course, that completely removed all the class barriers to pop music.
Now, was there a moment during your research when you realized Brian Epstein was even more influential than history had given him credit for?
Yes, I mean, I have to say this, right at the outset. Brian's influence was not only on pop music, it was on the place that Britain had in the world. Britain in the 1950s was thought to be pretty much clapped out after sort of national humiliations like the Suez Crisis. Suddenly, all at once, everybody in the world wants to know about Liverpool and wants to know about Britain. Um, and for this extraordinary influence that he never got any public honour at all. He didn't even get any thanks from the British government,
Mm.
which again is sort of traceable back to this this note of not only of homophobia but also of anti-Semitism that ran right through his very very short life.
That's what I was going to ask you. Now, you've had access to previously unpublished interviews and family material for this book, and were there any discoveries that surprised you even after all these years of studying the Beatles?
Yes, I mean, but it's the totality really. It was just how amazing he was, in and lucky too, of course, um, with his extraordinary intuition about them. but also the misery really that he suffered as a gay man and as a member of the Jewish faith. And it never stopped. It went right up until his life. He could walk into a restaurant with a close business associate, and he would hear a famous actor of the time saying, "I didn't know they let queers in here now." This is a ghastly thing to be happening to anybody, but at that
Yeah.
level, I mean, that level of fame and distinction, it was just disgusting.
Was it difficult to tell the story of a gay Jewish businessman living in Britain during the 1960s?
Well, yes, because it was really, he had to have a secret life. He had a life of a young business executive working in the family business before he branched out into management himself. But there was a nocturnal life as well, because he was a very, very sensitive and cultivated young man. But he had this streak of masochism, which sent him into the very worst place to look for straight male partners, which were the Liverpool Dogs. So he was constantly being beaten up and having to hide the fact from his parents because his parents were very conventional and respectable people. And there was no his mother. I think in the end, I did know his mother, Queenie, and I think in the end she did have a sort of good idea of what was the truth about him. But he could never really stand the idea that the Beatles knew. Of course, the Beatles knew. They knew all the time. They had a song called "Do You Want to Know a Secret," which was a kind of coded message that they knew all about it. He always deluded himself they didn't, as he put it, find out.
Now, John Lennon and Brian Epstein, they had a particularly fascinating relationship. So, what did you discover about that bond?
Well, that was on two levels. His involvement with the Beatles. He loved them platonically, as a parent, but he did fall in love with John, and it could never really be requited, and he knew it couldn't. Except at one point, he made a very ill-advised suggestion that he and John should go on holiday together to Spain, just the two of them, just after John's first child. But he should have been with his child and his wife Cynthia. And this happened. And it actually could have been disastrous. It might have stopped Beatlemania dead in its tracks. Because afterwards, at Paul's 21st birthday party, in fact, Bob Wooler, who was the Cavern DJ, made a sort of rather acid remark about the so-called honeymoon of Brian and John. And John actually beat Bob Wooler up. If that had got into the papers, and the papers then had investigated further into the fact that this gay man was managing four young men, that would have completely wiped them out there and then. Brian and his PR man for the Beatles, Tony Barrow, cleverly managed to avoid that. So then Beatlemania duly happened, but literally weeks after that.
The trip to Spain there's been a lot of speculation over the years about what happened on that trip between John and Brian. How did you separate documented history from decades of rumor?
Well, firstly, I had several interviews with the man who was probably Brian's closest associate, who was Peter Brown, who said, in a very tasteful way, Brian, Peter Brown had always modeled himself in every way on Brian, including the delicate and tactful way that he spoke. And he just communicated that Brian, they had a sexual encounter, but it wasn't penetrative, shall we say. Then later on with Yoko, who was a completely unshockable person. That was why John liked her, partly why he liked her. He said that he tried it twice. The first time to see what it was like, and the second time to make sure he didn't like it. Which is very John, but I mean, he wouldn't have lied to Yoko at that point.
Yeah. Oh, now you also describe his struggles with Brian Epstein's struggle with prescription drugs. Did writing those chapters change your perception of him?
Well, no, I mean, it started very, innocently with the slimming tablets the Beatles used to take in Germany so that they could stay awake all night to play these massive sets in these clubs. And later on, it was it was never really sort of on the surface. But again, very, very, he had his suits made with a special pocket where he could smuggle a pill out of his pocket into his mouth somehow and keep it hidden. Um, but yes, in the end, it was enormous and a heavy drinker too. Uh, but
Yeah.
still, you know, his brother Clive told me, his younger brother Clive, he always knew what he was taking, even when his intake was its heaviest. And he tried. He had lots of detoxing. It never seemed to work. He was trying that right to the end, really, trying to cut down his intake.
Now, we mentioned, he died extremely young, age 32. Do you think that the Beatles would have remained? I always thought, and this is my opinion only, I always thought that when he died, that was the beginning of the breakup for the Beatles.
Well, that's
So, do
absolutely
you?
true. I mean, John heard the news and said, "Well, then we're fucked," you know, and they were.
Yeah.
They had 2 years of drift when they
Yeah.
were looking for someone like Brian, a manager on the lines of Brian, which was impossible to find. And then they had an Alan Klein, which was disaster, and that was it.
Yeah. So you believe the Beatles would have remained together longer if Brian Epstein had still been there?
I think they would, yes, and they wouldn't. A lot of mistakes, a lot of advice that he could still have given them, because you know they always listened to him, and you know even we've just had Global Beatles Day. You're probably aware of that, which is
Yeah.
a celebration of their Our World satellite broadcast in 1967. Firstly, the Beatles didn't want to do that because they had taken a vow to do no more live shows, and this was going to be a live show in a recording studio, but still a live show. Secondly, they didn't. They thought they could just get away with doing a track from the Sergeant Pepper album. Brian said, "No, you've got to do something really special for this." So the result was "All You Need Is Love."
Amazing. It.
And in all of
Now,
the publicity about Global Beatles Day, Brian's name was never mentioned.
that's a shame. That really is a shame. I mean, it's, the you also mentioned that there on his death. Now, it was in August of 1967, almost 59 years ago now. Um, it was due to prescription drug accidental overdose.
Well, it was said to
That
be
was the
accidental
official.
by the coroner at the inquest, who seemed to be half asleep for most of the hearing, actually. Wasn't awake, neither was the pathologist. The same pathologist and coroner presided over the inquest on Jimi Hendrix 3 years later, which was an absolute disgrace. None of the right people were called. And to some extent, that was true in Brian's case as well. The full story was not told.
Right, and I'm going to talk about the opening chapter in your book because I don't want to give away everything because we want people to buy the book, okay? It's out now, okay? But there was some you found some things nefarious about Brian's death, didn't you?
Well, first of all, the opening of the book is about how in the 1960s, the two worst criminals in London East End, who were twins, Reggie and Ronnie Cray, wanted to take over the Beatles because they were celebrities at that time. And the way they planned to do it, actually, it was he died before the plan could be put into operation. But then afterwards, the Krays, who were the sort of London operation of the American mob, um, uh, one particular, the more sane of the two Krays, who was Reggie Cray, said of his death, Brian's death, it wasn't us, which meant that it was somebody.
Yes, it was somebody, and that's where I am. All I'm going to say about this because maybe it was not accidental suicide. And to find out more, the book is Mr. Moonlight. People can
This is
buy
very
it.
kind of you. Thank you.
No problem. Now let me ask you, if Brian Epstein could manage one current artist, who do you think he would choose?
Today, he was never, strangely enough, although he put the Beatles on such a pedestal, he was never satisfied with one. Um,
Hmm.
And if
He
you
had
think
he had
if you
a
think
group called
about it,
Circle, didn't he?
sorry.
He had a group called Circle too, didn't he?
Circle, yes, who many years later he believed in, and many years later they justified his belief in them, yes. But also, the Beatles, when you think about it, were the prototype boy band, and that was
Yes,
something
indeed.
else, and that was a new template for pop groups, of course. So in a way, but he was never satisfied with just one. He kept the Beatles apart, and Cilla Black, who he called My Cilla. He never called them My Beatles. But
Mhm.
otherwise, he was signing up all sorts of people, far more than he could really deal with. George Martin told me that he thought he was a Diaghilev, and he was all Diaghilev, the great ballet impresario who
Oh,
discovered people like Nijinsky. Brian thought he was kept on discovering Nijinskys, except
mhm.
they were called the foremost, or something like that. He had huge, broad vision. I think he would have probably been done much more in the theatre. The theatre was what he really loved, and always
Hmm.
sort of was trying to. He would have liked to be an actor. Then he would have liked to try to be a director. What he really would have been, I think, was a major West End producer in this country.
Do you, in all your years of researching the Beatles, is there one story that never made it into your books? One
Well, there's stories
fascinating.
about John Lennon in Hamburg that can never make it into anybody's book. Um, because John really was the original punk Johnny. Um, but a
He
lot
was
of
a real
this
teddy
stuff is
boy,
quite.
huh?
Yes, this is quite hard. This is not an easy read. The
Yeah.
life that Brian had. He only ever had one really stable gay relationship when he was very young, in his teens. And later on, he had a disastrous liaison with someone he signed up as an actor, but really was his boyfriend. These were terrible, terrible times that Brian went through.
Yes, I mean, I realize it. And is there another Beatles related figure who still deserves a full biography?
By me, by
You.
by me. There aren't many that actually deserve. I mean, I try to sort of do the top rung, and there
Right.
aren't really many people on that top rung. I've thought about Bob Dylan, but I think he would just be too sort of crotchety and boring. Um, and his life is all his music's all about his reading, not about his life. Um, I am going to write another biography about a band, but I can't tell you who they are.
Can't tell me yet. Okay. How about George Morton? Have you, I don't, forgive me if my ignorance, have you done one on him?
Well, he was a wonderful man, and of course, he was the extraordinary luck that the Beatles had after a lot of bad luck before they met Brian um, was that George Martin, Dick James, and Brian Epstein were fundamentally honest men. This is the biggest rock institution there ever was and ever will be. It was run by three honest men. And what are the odds
Amazing.
against that?
Yes, indeed. Well, Philip, this has been a fascinating conversation. The book is Mr. Moonlight, Brian Epstein, and the Making of the Beatles. The author is Philip Norman. It's published by, I hope I pronounce this right, Da Capo
That's right.
Press.
Yep.
Fantastic. Even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. Okay. Whether you're a lifelong Beatles fan or someone discovering their music for the first time, this book shines a well-deserved spotlight on a man whose belief, ambition, and determination helped change popular music forever. Again, Philip, thank you for being on Lights Camera Author.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and also down in the left-hand corner, you can order the book, find out more about it, all by scanning the QR code. So, thank you very much, Philip. I'm Jim Juno. Until next time, keep reading, keep watching, and keep discovering the stories behind the storytellers. This has been Lights Camera Author.